And thanks to everyone for being here today. It's great to see you, or we'll see you in a little bit, but it's great to be seen and it's great to know that everyone is here. This is work that Pat and I have done in participating in the SMMR project of MSPACE. And this is particular work from our portion about value and preferences in the marine space. So we're going to talk today about stakeholder perceptions of the marine planning process in the UK. Marine spatial planning as a thing is the idea of planning the marine space explicitly with stakeholder engagement included. It evolved to address multiple needs and goals of governments and stakeholders, including cutting red tape, promoting sustainable aquaculture and fishing, boosting ocean tourism, strengthening defense, and investing in ocean sciences. The point was to have better coordination across sectors that are involved in the marine space and a more organized approach to managing sea basins with lesser administrative burden. And it was supposed to promote inclusivity in ocean relation decision-making processes and effective policies to strengthen overall ocean governance and initiatives. At the heart of marine spatial planning is stakeholder engagement. This is the idea that people participate in the marine spatial planning, in the marine planning process, even though they are not actual government employees or planners. So it's seen by UNESCO as a public process of analyzing and allocating the spatial and temporal distribution of human activities in marine areas to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives that have been specified through a political process. Note that aside from the highlighted portion, it is not an end in itself, but a practical way to create and establish a more rational use of marine space and the interactions among its uses. Balance demands for development with the need to protect the environment. So, what does it look like right now? Well, 114 countries had adopted marine spatial planning as a tool by the end of 2023, but implementation is not uniform across the G20, definitely not across the rest of the countries, and it's not consistent in terms of institutional, technical, or human capacity to implement it. It is not standardized, and there aren't standard ways of evaluating whether it's been achieved. So we ask, in the United Kingdom, we look across 4 devolved nations and ask, to what extent has UK marine planning achieved the intended objectives of stakeholder engagement? We want to start first by saying the intended objectives, the stated objectives, are to incorporate stakeholder interests as a foundation for effectively implementing policies and committing to the pursuit of shared goals. So, in line with what UNESCO said, it's not an end in itself to incorporate stakeholders into marine planning. The idea is to incorporate their interests and use that as a foundation for effectively implementing policies and committing to shared goals. We undertake this work as part of the MSPACE project. This is one of the SMMR projects, Marine Spatial Planning Addressing Climate Effects. You can see here our general overview and work packages. Everything about this project is also about marine spatial planning. And what we examine is the governance structure and the values and preferences that people place on elements of the marine space in 3 particular sectors: fishing, fisheries, aquaculture, and conservation. We interviewed a number of people, and for the purposes of this presentation, we look at 71 total interviews with 79 people. So there were interviews that had multiple people in them. We conducted these with people who work and represent organizations interested in the marine space in England and the UK, in Wales, in Scotland, and in Northern Ireland. We used a couple of methods. We used multiple methods. We'll present data collected through two of them here. They're collected through a direct survey technique and interview, a semi-structured interview, and they're analyzed with a qualitative approach to interview analysis. With the 79 interviewees, we consider what they said to be a descriptive narrative of phenomena as experienced in their professional life. We took the transcripts and loaded them into the Deduce analytical software and employed inductive coding methods to analyze themes. We extracted dominant themes and then regrouped by sector and by nation to see what the data was telling us and what we could say to speak to this question. So I will now turn it over to Pat to tell you what we found.
Yes, thank you, Gina. Thanks for setting that all up. So the analysis looking across the four nations was, as Gina noted, it was inductive coding. So what we were looking for was, what are the themes that are coming out around stakeholder engagement, because that kept coming up. There are a number of other themes, but as Gina said, this is out of a larger research project. So what I'd like to present is 4 key themes that came up around stakeholder engagement and that are common to the 4 nations. There's a lot of information, and so it's going to feel a little bit summary here because we can't give you all of the different quotations, but we've chosen some citations that illustrate what we're trying to point out. So the 4 key themes that came up specifically around stakeholder engagement were, first of all, questions around stakeholder engagement process. There was a positive perception and anticipated benefits around the process, but there was also an acknowledgement of the complexity of the process, and that acknowledgement also took into consideration the different contextual the different contexts in which it was taking place, so the different devolved nations. There were concerns around siloed mentality in different government agencies, about the different forms of engagement, depending on either the period, the time in the marine planning process, or the type of stakeholder, as well as timing and motivations of decisions around the marine plans. So that was the first key theme, was stakeholder engagement process itself. The second key theme was the who and the what of engagement, the selection of stakeholders. Who was representative of a certain category of stakeholders? Were there stakeholders left out? There were questions around the variable levels of engagement as well, with some sectors having very high levels of engagement and some sectors having lower levels of engagement, if not no level of engagement in certain regions. There are also questions around unequal access and treatment of different types of stakeholders. So the who and the what of the engagement was one of the topics that came up quite a bit across the 4 nations. The third key theme was addressing conflict. Addressing conflict is one of the key elements, one of the key motivators of stakeholder engagement. In other words, if stakeholders are able to talk about potential conflicts, to bring them out into the open, then the idea is that it will allow a way to work through that conflict before it actually happens. However, there were concerns around what addressing conflict means. Is it simply notification of an activity that's going to happen, or is it consultation and communication around an activity or a decision that's been made? There were questions around hard and soft constraints, which are activities that cannot happen in the same space, and which are activities that can happen in the same space, and how that represents competing interests in the space, the marine space. And coming out of that was this question of the arbitration seems to be largely left to stakeholders. Okay, these are perceptions. Remember that these are perceptions. So that was the third key theme. The fourth key theme was the actual outcome of the marine planning process and stakeholder engagement. The marine plan is perceived as being on a scale that's just too big to be meaningful to a lot of different stakeholders. It also is perceived to be a catch-all of all different types of activities, a very positive and hopeful catch-all, but maybe not realistic. And it also, the outcome being the marine plan itself, after the stakeholder engagement, is perhaps misplaced expectations around what the marine plan is actually going to provide. So those are four key themes that came out. Here is one example of an extract of a citation from one of the interviews. Tensions exist on how engagement happens, which is mainly through professional associations with paid professionals whose job is to engage and negotiate with government and government process. There's a lot of issues for those who are not members of those associations. So this illustrates the fact that the stakeholder engagement happened in certain ways that were amenable to certain sectors, but maybe not to other sectors. Okay. What is very interesting about our analysis is that a lot of the concerns were really pointing to larger marine governance concerns. So a lot of the questions around the stakeholder engagement process, or issues in the stakeholder engagement process, were pointing to bigger questions around the coherence of the marine strategy, around bureaucratic processes that were engaged to carry out this marine planning, as well as the internal and external constraints that became evident through the different through the stakeholder engagement process, but also through the marine planning process. So what does that mean? In coherence of strategy, it might look like a little bit of a laundry list, but it's really a number of indicators of the conditions in which the marine strategy is taking place. So it's a high-level vision. However, the conditions seem to be working with the stakeholders perceive that they're working with siloed regulators. The ambitious targets are wonderful, except that there are a lot of different changing conditions around that. There are multiple sectors and multiple goals that are involved. The data gaps were brought up numerous times. There's insufficient supporting science, and that might depend also on the sector. So as you can see, there are a number of different elements of the conditions in which this marine strategy and the marine planning is taking place. And what did that lead to? That led or leads to certain outcomes. There's a perception that there's a mismatch between policy adoption and the implementation, that there in certain cases was duplication or overlap of jurisdictions and tax regimes. And a lot of the marine planning is happening with neighboring nations, both within the United Kingdom or with other nations like the Netherlands and France. There's a perception of policy lag and a delay in incorporating the scientific findings, so a need for the data, but also delay in incorporating these scientific findings, and contradictions between new and existing policies, as well as inefficiencies. So a quote to give you an example of one of the interviewees their questioning was, well, we have to decide what outcomes we want to target from a marine environment. Do we want to target people with them? Do we want to target employment? Do we want to target energy security? Do we want to target food provision? Do we want to target trade? Very different foods. What do we want to do? Do we want to be a true world leader in biodiversity protection? We've got to accept that multiple objectives doesn't work. So this is an example of the confusion around the coherence of the strategy. So the second category is the bureaucratic processes. So in this larger marine governance, there are a number of bureaucratic processes, and the conditions are that these bureaucratic processes are lengthy, they're very complex, it's an onerous process, both in people as well as in time. However, some of these bureaucratic processes are presenting the same conditions for all stakeholders, regardless of their sector or their size, which, as you can imagine, is a larger burden on small-sized organizations compared to larger-sized organizations. Another one of the conditions that came up very often was the civil service churn. There's a perception that the interlocutor that they have is not the one that they will have over a longer period of time. So kind of starting over again. It's never-ending process, little advancement of issues or queries. A query might be lodged and then picked up by another person, and it feels like the process is starting over again. I'm going to skip and go to diffuse process. There are many people, many agencies, many levels of government that are involved in the decision making, and it gets very confusing around that. And then finally, I'll skip to the last one, changing approaches, changing assumptions and types and levels of engagement with stakeholders. And they perceive that throughout the stakeholder engagement process, which is considered to be a process that takes place throughout all of the marine planning steps. So what does that lead to? That leads to a number of outcomes, like the perception of unfairness, that it is an unlevel playing field between organizations, between stakeholders, and between sectors. There's a perceived lack of consistency in the application of policies and rules. Policies might be made, but they might not be implemented in the way that they were perceived to be implemented when they were put out. There's an underlying lack of trust. Is this process actually, is the governance actually doing what it says it's going to do? Is the participation doing what it says it's supposed to do? Are these decisions being made the way they said they were going to be made? There's a perceived heavier burden for stakeholders that are smaller and have fewer resources. And I'll skip again to the last one. Not our remit is an element that comes up quite often. In other words, we get back to this idea of siloed government agencies, and that is that one will deal with one aspect, but not with another because it's not their remit. One citation that gives an example of these bureaucratic processes is there's not an enabling culture within the agencies. It's always very much, how can we stop this? It seems to be a very marine way of thinking, that their main management measure is stopping something. It's terribly difficult, certainly for small guys trying to do something. So this perception of the bureaucratic processes is something that was very apparent and is pointing to the larger way, how are we governing the marine space? And finally, the last point is these internal and external constraints. And there are quite a few that were listed. The conditions of human resources and workload scarcity, the funding scarcity came up a number of times, and budgetary tensions. In other words, the stakeholder engagement process might take place, but we know that overall budgetary tensions exist. So maybe the work that we've done won't be able to be carried out. There are a lack of people to oversee the planning reports and the updates. There's a perception of attrition in government. Again, these budgetary tensions and lack of understanding about how much time and how many resources are actually needed. The relationship between sectors is a big constraint. Some sectors have very strong or frequent relationships. Others don't have as much. And all of that in the context, and this is one of the external constraints, of increasing traffic on the seas and increasing activity or desire to see certain activities on the seas. So what does that come out with? Well, the outcomes from that is that there's a perception that there's a prevention of upscaling and transferring of pilot and trial approaches and solutions, that because of budgetary constraints, because of human resource constraints, because of other activities that are happening, that this isn't moving fast enough. There doesn't seem to be a balance between the evidence that's needed to change something and the speed at which it needs to be done. These long processes appear to have not a clear end date, seem to be drawn out quite a bit. I'm mindful of time, so I think I'll go ahead to the citation. I think you get the point that the perception of these internal and external constraints generally around marine governance raises a lot, are based on a lot of questions around these processes. So one citation that illustrates this is one interviewee who says, so somewhere in our system, we've got the toxic legacy in the marine environment that's not regulated by us. It's been there for decades, takes decades to work through the system as well. That's something that we don't really consider. The question is, who will? This is a question of what part of the agency. So what I'd like to point is our question is, to what extent has the UK marine planning achieved the intended objectives of stakeholder engagement? And just a reminder, those intended objectives are to incorporate the stakeholder interests as a foundation for effectively implementing these policies, and also as a foundation to committing to the pursuit of shared goals. What came out of our interviews and the analysis was that stakeholders were really expressing a lot of confusion over the engagement process itself, over the who and the what of engagement, over how conflict would actually be addressed or has been addressed, and the actual outcomes of this stakeholder engagement. They also expressed frustration over the incoherence of the strategy, the marine strategy overall, over a cumbersome and confounding bureaucratic process or processes, and around the internal and external constraints that are very evident in the process and around marine governance in general. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Gina to finish.
Thank you so much, Pat. So what is it that we find? We find that throughout our outcomes of these different conditions, a lot of distrust in the process, and where there isn't outright distrust, at least some healthy skepticism, frustration, and uncertainty. Essentially, people aren't sure whether their voices are being heard and whether their views are being incorporated into the plans. They don't know how the plans work, and they don't know how they would evaluate sufficiently whether their views are incorporated. So we're left with some questions still. Are the interests incorporated? Are the goals shared? And will the policies be effectively implemented? Now, the good news is that stakeholders remain interested in participating and engaging, and they are hopeful that engagement could lead to successful outcomes. They also, in many ways, see that if there's a chance that they could lead to, that their engagement could lead to shared goals and better implementation and an incorporation of their views, then they don't want to miss that chance. So they feel that they need to participate just in case things work out as they're intended. And they're looking to see, all of the nations are currently in planning stages of either their first or second marine plan. So the plans that come out of this round it would be the first for Northern Ireland, but the second for the others, will really determine what stakeholders believe has been accomplished by the stakeholder engagement. It remains clear, however, that meaningful stakeholder engagement needs to be more than just a tokenistic move for participation. It is not an end in itself. And we risk stakeholders withdrawing if they perceive that their views are dismissed or not considered, if they perceive that there are questionable practices going on in marine planning, or if they don't perceive any tangible results. That is what we have to share with you today. We appreciate it's been pretty swift. We wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So we're happy to go back through any of the information on the slides, or as you can imagine, lots of information that isn't on the slides, but that we're happy to answer or take questions about.